October 5th, 1789, Paris, France. A woman walks through the streets of Paris, beating on a drum. Soon, she is joined by more women, and more women. All are hungry. All want cheaper bread. And they are going to see the king. Hello, and welcome back to History in Focus, your one-stop shop for the stuff they didn't teach you in school. This week, we'll celebrate Women's History Month by focusing on the Women's March on Versailles and its impact on the French Revolution. Just remember to give freedom a ring and hit that subscribe button. They say, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and in Paris 1789, that was incredibly true. By now, the French Revolution was in full swing, the Bastille had been stormed, the National Assembly formed, and yet the situation hadn't changed for the poor and working class of Paris. Poor harvests and high inflation were crushing them. Many were going hungry, many more were angry, wondering why the king wasn't doing something. Murmurs began to spread of going to Versailles. Fearing another situation like the Bastille, King Louis sent for the elite Flanders regiment to come to the Palace of Versailles and add more protection to the palace grounds. When they arrived on October 1st, they were greeted with a welcoming banquet, which was typical. Toasts were had and merriment was widespread. Now, I'm no king, but having a feast while the citizens of your kingdom are starving is probably not the most brilliant idea. Papers in Paris reported the events of the feast as an orgy of gluttony and debauchery. The cockade, the symbol of the French Revolution, had been stepped on and desecrated. That was the last straw. As the women marched through the streets of Paris, they armed themselves with knives, cudgels, and anything else sharp, and headed for the Hôtel de Ville, where a large store of muskets and gunpowder was held. The sympathetic National Guardsmen at the Hôtel de Ville did not really try to stop the women, unwilling to fire on their fellow citizens. Now armed with muskets and a pair of cannons, the mob stood for a second, unsure of what to do next, until a man cried out, "À Versailles!" and the women turned and began a 6-hour march to the royal palace, encouraged and joined by onlookers as they went. The Marquis de Lafayette, yes, that Lafayette, was assembling his National Guardsmen to stop this march, but to his great dismay, he found that his guardsmen were more sympathetic to the women and were wanting to join them. Unwilling to let an unorganized army march with an angry mob, Lafayette decided to lead his men to Versailles, but dispatched a courier to try and ride ahead and warn the king of what was coming. When the women arrived, they were not allowed into the palace grounds, but were invited to sit at the National Assembly, which met in the nearby Opera House. They made their demands known and milled about until a group of them was invited to meet the king so he could hear their demands. He did, and the women left, while the king conferred with his ministers. At about 6 p.m., Lafayette and the National Guardsmen arrived. He then met with his monarch and told him that it probably would be safer for him and the royal family if he agreed to go back to Paris the following day. Early on the morning of October 6th, the gates of Versailles were opened, and the mob, hungry and now cold and wet from the rain, stormed in. As they entered the palace, they began to call for the head of Queen Marie Antoinette. Gunshots rang out, and guardsmen were killed. Hearing the mobs, she ran to the king's bedchambers, barely escaping her would-be captors. The violence ebbed as the mob ran out of energy, and was finally stopped completely by Lafayette, who had the women escorted outside of the palace and assembled on the courtyard. There, they waited, until King Louis and Lafayette stepped out onto the balcony. The people cheered. Then, the king proclaimed his eagerness to return with the mob and National Guard to Paris, accompanied by the queen and their children. Marie Antoinette then stepped out onto the balcony, where Lafayette proceeded to bow, kiss her hand, and pin the revolutionary cockade on one of the guardsmen. The crowd outside went berserk, after this proclaiming, "Vive la Reine!" That afternoon, the king, the National Guard, the mob, and the royal ministers began the march back to Paris. The National Assembly would follow the king a few months later. While not as dramatic as the storming of the Bastille, the March on Versailles ended any remaining divide between king and people. The Palace of Versailles would never again be occupied by a monarch of France, eventually becoming a museum. The royal family essentially became prisoners in Paris, and while for a time attempted to work within the framework of a new constitutional monarchy, eventually attempted a failed flight from Paris 2 years later. This would eventually lead to the death of the king and queen. Most importantly, it signaled the power of popular movements and foreshadowed the future mob rule that came to dominate Paris in the later half of the revolution and would inaugurate the Reign of Terror. If you enjoyed this week's content, please subscribe for future videos. Let us know what you thought in the comments below and what you would like us to cover next.